I want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming to Looking Backward, Looking Forward, an intergenerational discussion among activists about lessons learned and directions to go in creating progressive social change, radical social change, movement social change. I'm John Boylan. I am co-convening this conversation with Philip Wallstetter, who just stood up, who's an old friend of Mark Rudd's, who is the guest of honor here. So I think, without further ado, Philip will introduce Mark, and then I will introduce the guest panelists, and then we'll get started. Clear? Very good. Philip, take it away.
I'd like to claim to be an old friend of Mark, but I'm really an old acquaintance and I think a new friend. Mark was my doubles partner, he doesn't remember, in freshman tennis at Columbia. And he also, Paul Auster once brought Mark and me together to be in a play that Mark had written for Jack Gelber's playwriting class at Columbia. He was the playwright of The Connection. Mark had done an adaptation of Mario and the Magician by Thomas Mann. And I had just recently played Hamlet on campus, so I was really excited, and we walked around campus one afternoon and I was showing how I would interpret Mark's part. But we really reconnected at the 40th anniversary of the Columbia Revolt in 2008, a wonderful 4-day conference. But I'd like to start off by explaining why I instigated this discussion, which in a way is a discussion that's been going on internally within me from a day I can precisely date, September 11th, 1973. You will recognize that date, many of you. It was the day that Salvador Allende was overthrown in Chile. I happened to be there on a street corner beside the Moneda watching the palace rocket bombed. And I've been struggling to write a book about it for many years. But in the course of that, I had a chance to examine a great deal of what Chileans themselves, who participated in the wonderful 3 years of the Allende experiment, had to say about their own about the process. We tend to look at it outside in very simple terms. CIA, Kissinger, boom, that explains it. But in a way that makes the Chileans victims who simply bowed to a stronger power. And those Chileans who were exiled all over the world afterwards, in East Germany, in Russia, in Hungary, in Venezuela, in Barcelona, in Paris, in Seattle, in Mexico, had many years to think about why didn't it work? What did we do wrong? What could we have done differently? How could we have maintained the initiative that we had in 1970, which suddenly was turned around? They were willing to take responsibility, or total responsibility, rather than just saying, it wasn't our fault, these other people were just stronger than us. Sorry, I just bopped Councilman Nick Licata on the head, an old friend. And I found myself profoundly dissatisfied with the quality of the reflection that we who had been involved in the anti-war movement, either as leaders or as people who were just following along, which is all I was, had undertaken about what happened and why America for 40 years suddenly drifted off into this time warp that maybe we're in the process of getting out of, but we will again have to kind of rebuild what we had started and continue a road that we've gotten off of. What I found listening to Mark and what I found reading his book is that Mark, too, has been haunted by this for many years. He regrets what ought to be regretted, but rather than simply being contrite, which is the role that the American media asks anybody to play, a wonderful book called The Art of the Public Grovel, which explains how to apologize in public, use religious language, cry, say you won't do it again. Mark has been haunted to the extent that he is reflected again and again and again what happened. He's gone through every minute of it and so forth. He told me he wrote 30,000 pages to get the 330 pages of the book. So I've been impressed by the quality of Mark's reflection. I think we agree probably on 93% of what he proposes, and I'll let you I will now introduce my old Columbia College classmate and new friend. I'm proud to say Mark Rudd, who will tell you a little bit about the road along which he has traveled.
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. Give me a 3.5 minute warning. Okay. Hi. Thank you, Phil.
Maybe it's better for the...
Would that be better? Or is this okay?
It's fine.
It's all right? Okay. I think this is going to be an informal discussion, and I was assured at the beginning this is not a panel discussion. I don't know what it is, but it's not a panel discussion.
We have sworn to do it without knowing what it is.
Yeah, okay, because...
Anybody who defines it will be asked to...
Right. I detest panel discussions. Is my clock running? No. Okay. Well, first, really, thanks, Phil and John, and thank everybody for coming. And those of you who came last night, we had a blast, and it was great. And also, I might add, this is the first time, last night was the first time there was any significant number of young people at any of my talks. And I've been, for the last month, slogging my way through old people to try to get to young people. But a year from now, the paperback will come out, but I'm trying to get maybe a 6-minute podcast or maybe a cartoon version of the book or something. But anyway, I've been on the road, actually, since 2003 also, with the movie first. And then I spent 2 years working...
What movie?
I'm sorry, The Weather Underground came out in 2003. And I've taken it around maybe 100 places, a lot of college campuses, and I've done a lot of talking with young people about it. And also, I worked for 2 years on an attempt to rebuild SDS. The students initiated it. 2006, 2007 didn't really go too far, but in that time, generally I'm always asked the same questions, which is, how did you build a mass movement? How are mass movements built? What should we do now? Why don't we have a mass movement? You know. And a lot of even more naive questions like, you know, I call this the Tom Brokaw question: how did you do Columbia? You know, anyway, in 2000, a couple of years ago, an old friend gave me a book, which is a case study of organizing in Mississippi, in Greenwood, Mississippi, by SNCC. It's called I've Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne, P-A-Y-N-E. And it covers 1960 to about 65 in Greenwood, Mississippi. Payne himself was not a participant. He is an African-American sociologist, though, and he went and talked to the people involved. And he developed a kind of an analysis of how they organized. Greenwood, Mississippi is in the Delta. I grew up in New Jersey. I didn't know what the Delta was other than Robert Johnson blues, you know. But it is a treeless plain in which only cotton is grown, and it's one step away from slavery. And SNCC was able to build a successful voter rights movement as part of the larger civil rights movement in the Mississippi Delta in Greenwood. The method they used involved long-term strategy with patient work. The key element was personal engagement between people. Almost to the level of friendship, but really getting to know people, the organizers and the organized. The movement was democratic in the sense that it had full participation of people. And also it helped develop people's leadership skills. It was a fully democratic movement. Actually, this model, the origins of it to a large extent, or to some extent, came from Ella Baker, who was the intellectual mentor of SNCC. And when I read about this and saw the actual description of people knocking on doors and helping to bolster each other, I realized that that was exactly the same method that I had been recruited to SDS at Columbia with. And it was, I think, the same method that overall built the peace movement and the labor movement before that. Now, after Columbia and Weatherman and a lot of other stuff happened, I was involved in two organizing campaigns extended over long years. One was in the 80s, the Central American Solidarity Movement. We were somewhat successful. In the end, we did not win that war as we did the earlier one, but we basically used the same method. It was this organizing method. Personal engagement between people, long-term strategy, patient work, democratic, and developing people's leadership skills. And when I went around, the other was union organizing for 15 years in my workplace. I was an organizer with the AFT, the teachers union, and we won that particular one. But talking with young people in those few years, and I'm going to stop now, I found that hardly anybody had ever seen or heard of anything like this, the organizing method. I call it the traditional organizing method. But they had kind of conjured up an image of spontaneous explosions that happened off of a few people expressing themselves. Now, my book is all about that. Is about, in a sense, the first section is organizing. The second section is self-expression and not such good organizing. And the last section, Weatherman, is existential politics and horrible organizing. So, my question is, what is organizing? And there's many people here who have been in many organizing campaigns and still are. But what is useful that young people can use? And how are young people organizing now? And how are they updating this model now using the internet to spread out, broaden personal engagement? So that to me is why what I came for today. So thank you.
You can just leave that there for now. Thank you a lot, Mark. That's great. In case any of you don't know, Mark Rudd was one of the foremost or best-known student activists in the 60s. And just to run a quick history for people who may not know, in 1968, there's two groups of students, and they were basically divided, but together. A group of African American students and a group of white students at Columbia took over several buildings at Columbia. There was a police action that was violent, and but it was very successful in bringing media and public attention to issues around Columbia's attitudes toward its neighborhood, toward racism, and toward the Vietnam War. Mark later then went to what became the Weather Underground, which was attempting to follow the models of Che Guevara to actually create a revolutionary, violent overthrow of the United States. You kind of had to be there to understand why that made sense at the time, but it did for a lot of people, and I think Mark will talk about that later. I'm going to say also, I run smaller conversations, usually with four guests around Seattle. I've been doing it for years. A number of you are on my mailing list. If you want to be on my mailing list for similar, smaller conversations, mostly around art and politics, let me know at the end. The next one I'm going to be doing is about freedom and responsibility. And it happens at a bar art gallery called Vermilion up on Capitol Hill. And then I'm doing also a potluck conversation around community at a house on Capitol Hill, and I'm sending out notices about those in a couple of days. I want to introduce the guests. This is not a panel. They will not speak as panelists. We will all converse. So the guests will converse with the other participants, and the other participants will communicate with the guests. The idea about bringing the guests is to make sure that we have a sufficient amount of people who have specific expertise, experience, and passion in the topic at hand. But that's not to assume that the rest of you do not have the same expertise, experience, and passion. So we want to hear from the whole room before the night is through. I will moderate for the next half hour, and then Philip will take over, and then we'll switch back to me. I want to introduce the guests, however, alphabetically by first name. Come on, computer. There we go. Alberta Maas is a youth organizer. Mejia, thank you. Damn, I can't do that. Mejia. Alex Steffen runs World-Changing, a website that deals with paths toward a sustainable future, I think is one way to put it. Carrie Moon is supposed to be here, organizer of the co-director of the People's Waterfront Coalition, which has been for years trying to build us a good waterfront as opposed to a gigantic, monstrous waterfront, which could happen as well. Ow. That seems to be a running theme in this conversation. Hollis Wong-Ware is a hip-hop poet, youth activist, and student. Jocelyn Plank, who works in humanitarian work in Vietnam, which is very interesting given the issues of 40 years ago, is not here. She also had a bicycle accident. City Councilman Nick Licata is over here, was a student activist a number of years ago, same time frame, I think, as Mark. Paul Dorpat is a local historian and was the editor of The Helix, which was the underground newspaper in Seattle in the 1960s. Pete Knudsen is an anthropologist, a fisherman, and activist around fishermen's issues. He was active in the issue of the fishermen's terminal and the attempt to basically, I guess you could say, drive out the fishermen. Was that the... That's a good summary. That's a good summary, yeah. Randy Angstrom is the founding director of the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, which is a focal point of youth activism and education around in Seattle, as well as being housing for artists and a lot of other things. And also is engaged in a variety of other issues. Is on the Seattle Arts Commission and the Lower Duwamish District Council. Robbie Stern is a longtime activist and lobbyist with the Washington State Labor Council, was an SDS Students for Democratic Society leader at the University of Washington in the 60s. Roger Littman, peace and justice and environmental activist, is over here. Thank you. You moved. Thank you. Toby Crittenden just came in. He's with a group called Washington Bus, which is, have a seat. Which is does work around voting activism and youth. So we're going to open this up in a minute. I want to say one thing, which is, to me, in putting this together with Philip, I've been thinking a lot about the idea that, for me, I always saw a dichotomy between issues organizers and electoral politics organizers. And the difference to me was, in a nutshell, that the issues organizers never compromised, and the electoral politics organizers always compromised. And that's a stupid generalization, but it has a kernel of truth. There's a third kind of organizing that's easy to forget, and Mark touched on it, and that's people organizing. And in the end, I think that is the core of all of our organizing, whether we're dealing with electoral electoral politics or issues. We're organizing people, we're organizing communities, we're organizing relationships, we're bringing people together. So, one more thing before we get started. For people who saw the emails, I asked for a bunch of comments from people who are the guests. And here are some of the things I've gotten in a nutshell. Hollis talked about the idea of social networks online and popular media. How does that advance or hinder both organizing and social progress? Mark's major question was, what good organizing is going on now, especially by young people? Alex Steffen talked about the idea that the model we've been using of action campaigns funded by donors with narrowly defined outcomes is broken and insufficient to the task ahead of us. What would be sufficient to the task ahead of us? Carrie, who's not here, talked about the balance between iron fist and velvet glove tactics, and I think she'd have to come to explain what she meant. Roger was talking about his focus will be on how we develop our ideas. And the reason why I'm reading this is we have so many people, we don't have time for them to talk, to basically make speeches before the conversation starts. So I'm doing it for them. Forgive me. Randy talked about he seeks to mitigate the effects of institutional cynicism among the progressive movement in this region, and I'm curious about what he has to say about that. And naive. He is also naive and optimistic enough to believe that measurable, meaningful change is possible in our time. Robbie talks about what sectors are critical to win the fights that we've got to fight in terms of economic and social justice. Given that no sector of the society is able to win the battle for equality and justice by themselves, what are the ways in which we can be united? What lessons have we learned regarding coalition building over the course of the past 50 years? Pete Knudsen talks about specifically a lack of historical memory among popular movements in the United States and looks at the idea of a sectarian dynamic, political groups becoming ever more sectarian, something Mark talked about last night, the sense of being a vanguard. I'm smarter than you. I know what I'm doing and you don't, but you can follow. How do we deal with that? Is this sectarian dynamic an obstacle in today's organizing efforts to create a more just United States? So I hope that was a good summary. All right. So basically, what we're going to do right now is we're going to open this up. The guests will speak, but everybody will speak. So maybe I'm going to pick on somebody, and
why did I know?
I'm going to pick on Hollis,
Okay.
and then we'll take it from there.
Okay. Wow. Well, that's not putting me on the spot at all.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, well, I guess I'll just start with the questions that I initially asked when I was prompted to. By the way, when I'm on my phone, I'm actually taking notes on my phone, which might date me. I'm not text messaging. But I suppose, I'm a 21-year-old college student about to graduate. I am an artist, and I'm also involved with various youth projects, particularly organizing youth, empowering them through the creative arts, through spoken word poetry and hip-hop production, most specifically, and then also through the work that I do at the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center. And I hear that question about the loss of historical memory, and I'm actually a history major, so that has particular weight for me as well. But I think what's most interesting in hearing your reflections, I'm not personally involved with my college campus at all, and I don't know whether that's just because of the timeliness of everything, but I do feel like we're at a critical point in politics. So sometimes I wonder, I know that my father often talks about how kids are so apathetic these days, and kids are always just kind of glued to their screens as opposed to like going out into the streets. But in many ways, we use the screens very strategically, those of us who are interested in progressive movements. And I think that we're still negotiating and navigating what the internet can do for us and how it can distract us in those movements as well. So Do I need to start off with a question, or?
You just need to say what you think is important to you, and make observations, which you've been doing very well.
Okay. Can I talk about Twitter? I'm going to talk about Twitter. Who's heard about Twitter? Raise your hand. All right, let's talk about it. I'm into it. I'm really into Twitter.
I don't think that does it justice.
Look, I see Twitter as kind of, and I see a lot of social networking sites, and I understand that this is a great divide, actually, generationally, and that's not to. I think it's just something that I personally feel very passionate about. But I see social networking sites as truly the new frontier for our generation to really kind of standardize and try to figure out how we can utilize social networking ways and what I was saying before in a way that progresses us and makes us more intentional, as opposed to distracts us and disperses us to kind of our another like kind of internal reflection, as opposed to people organizing.
Can I ask you a question about social networking?
Yeah.
I don't understand how social networking gets beyond. I don't understand how. I don't do social networking, so I don't understand it. I don't understand how social networking moves beyond certain limits. In other words, how do you talk to people, or how do you communicate to people who are not like you? Because one of our goals is, well, both growth and coalition. So how do you get in a social? Do social networks expand and go beyond and grow?
Right. It's so interesting because I'm like trying to think about the social networks and like the recent friends that I've added to my Facebook, per se, or for example. Okay, so I just recently performed in a hip hop show. Me and Toby, actually, Toby's my DJ. I performed at a hip hop show that was put on by Students for Palestine at the University of Washington, and it was featuring really the largest hip hop group in Palestine right now, who's really making collective noise. And they're not only making music but they're also truly gathering people for like Palestinian solidarity within the nation state of Israel. And I would, first of all, would never have been able to interact with these people as a performer and them as performers and like participate in that space if it wasn't for social networking, frankly. A lot of music and a lot of artistry is being disseminated through the internet now, and it wouldn't be, the connections would be so distant between artists that are producing in Palestine and artists that are producing in Seattle, let alone having them on the same stage somewhere where resources can be tied down and students can come and really interact with transnational political movements. So I mean, that's, I guess, one example for me. And it's interesting because it's like from my purview, that's my standard. When I think about the ways to interact with people, to keep up with people, pen paling is as easy as sending a message, and inviting 300 people to your event is just as easy as pressing a button. And whether that's the most effective way of interacting is interesting, but like social networking is true social networking. Like we really truly are building communities that can expand through space and can really like grow the confines of communication, not only through cities but also like transnationally as well. And so that's one like particular aspect that sticks out to me.
All right, so first off, I work with the Washington Bus, which works with young people specifically, getting them engaged in the political process. And so we do a lot on Facebook because young people love Facebook. But who in here, could you put your hand up if you have a Facebook account? Is everybody who doesn't have their hand up relatively familiar with Facebook in general? More or less? Okay, if you're not, put your hand up. Okay, basically Facebook this is important because this is what it comes to.
The point of intergenerational communication, the reverberation is horrible on my hearing aids.
Okay. I will try to reverberate less.
Speak slower.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. That is a life lesson right there, I think. Okay, so Facebook is basically an online tool that all it is you have a personal profile, your friends have profiles, you share pictures, you share information, you share interactions in an online form. It's extremely simple concept that is a sort of a different format if you're not used to it. It's an interesting question of what does online organizing, what do social networks have to do? Like, do they actually work beyond your immediate sphere of people? And I would say the answer is yes and also no. The answer is no, in that you have to be online, you have to be on Facebook, you have to be engaged in these things for them to actually affect you in that immediate vein. But on the flip side, we did an event in February, not tied to one specific action, not tied to anything particularly pressing. It was a celebration of the inauguration and just sort of a general sort of civic explosion of civicness, whatever you want to call it. And we started organizing it a few weeks before the event. We were anticipating, we weren't really sure how many people were going to come. We utilized, almost all of our organizing came through Facebook, came through these networks where we invited people to come to our event, and they invited their friends, and their friends invited their friends. So it became not about who we knew, but who the people we knew. And it became this event that we ended up having people out the door. We couldn't fit everybody in because, and it was people we didn't know. It was people who were coming because their friends told them. So it shared what is a trusted source, what is a trusted messenger, and how do you get that message out beyond just your immediate circle that you already see.
Just to put this in terms of 1960s, it's like having like a Stetner machine on every street corner, churning all the time.
Yeah, I've had, it's just so funny to be talking about this, Toby, because like 2 weeks ago, some of the young organizers who I'm working with around healthcare reform said to me, Robbie, you got to have a Facebook account. I said, you're shitting me. No, you got to have a Facebook account. So I actually had one of them, Rachel Berkson, talk me through setting up how to do it. She had to explain to me how to get my picture on it because I had no idea. But the amazing thing is that what happened was once I did it and I put on it the flyer for this healthcare reform event that we're doing on May 30th, people started picking it up and started sending it out to a lot of other people. And the reason why I knew that was because I got a copy of it, because, every time they do, they come and they take it and they send it out elsewhere. I get a copy of it. Now, I just want to say, I think it's one tool of many, but it is a tool that thankfully you all have taught us. And it's, and I'm still not comfortable with it, I got to say. I don't know how to use it real well yet, and I call for advice. And the other day I called and said, well, how do I delete something from my Facebook profile? Or not the profile, the homepage. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. Once you get answers, it just goes away on its own, and you don't do deletions. Okay, I can live with that. So, I think that it is not a substitute for down and dirty, face-to-face organizing. It is not going to work with a whole lot of people who are not generationally, like where you all are. But by God, it sure is an effective tool. My son picked it up. He's down in Los Angeles and sent a copy of the announcement of the march and rally to all of his friends back in Seattle, saying, "Y'all got to go to this." And so it's another tool and one to be respected.
As an old-timer, I rely on email a lot, but I do have to do a Facebook page. But this whole thing was organized with just email, which is segue to Alex.
That I'm stuck in email? I think there's a couple interesting things. You ask, how do people find things out? And I think that one of the, many people here may remember the milligram experiment, 6 degrees of separation experiment, where he asked a random person to get a letter passing hand to hand to another random person in another state, and found that on average it could happen in 6 passes, where somebody would say, oh, I know a truck driver, give it to that guy. Truck driver would give it to the next person, and so forth. Right? That effect is the network effect, right? There's a network of people between those two people. And what we've found increasingly with social networking stuff is that, in fact, that network effect is incredibly powerful. But there are a couple real limitations. There's a woman named Dana Boyd who does some pretty amazing research on this stuff, and one of the things that she found is that while it is increasingly easy to get information out within a social network, there are discrete and separate social networks. And so, for example, many people who listen to a lot of right-wing radio or television get no information whatsoever from any of the sources that we get our information, right? There's completely separate conversation with almost no connection. And that the same thing is true on other divides, a big one being class, that people who are working class tend to use sites like MySpace and other sort of more, I don't even know how you describe them, but more sort of fundamental sites, perhaps. And so they aren't having the same conversation as people who are, heavily engaged in Twitter, who tend to be very educated, tech-savvy folks, right? And I think that adding to that the recent information that that there's certain kinds of things that really work well online, and one of them is the dissemination of what I call personal responsibility steps, where somebody says, hey, you ought to do this. Right? Like, you ought to not buy that product because that company sucks. You ought to do buy a light bulb and plug it in because compact fluorescents save energy. That kind of thing that you can do yourself in a small step, right? Spreads really quickly. But I actually think there's a really giant gap between personal responsibility steps and personal engagement, and that's where I think right now a lot of online activism breaks down. Is it can get me to the point where I click to send an email to my congressman, but it won't get me to the public meeting necessarily, or much less get me to join a group or something.
So let's talk to Alberto, and these guys are doing something with youth organizing around personal interactions. And let's hear what you're doing around that.
Sure. So, my name's Alberto. I am a program director at Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, and these are some of my colleagues right here. And I think maybe, I don't mean to veer the conversation away too much, but when you said, what is organizing? I kind of feel organizing it has to start with awareness, and I feel like it's facilitation from that point. And what I mean by that is, for example, with young people, I guess I could just talk about a program we're running right now. So we have a space, Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, and there had been after-school programs that were offered by some of the separate organizations housed there, which are mostly arts-based youth-serving nonprofits that take different angles. Some combine nature, Arts Corps, which you guys know is a really strong model for putting artists in schools, Power of Hope, camp format, and so on. But the space was being vastly underutilized, and one idea for a program I had is, after doing some research into what was going on in the center and how people felt about what is the quality of youth programming there, we adopted a sort of revamped system where there's a council of young people, and they're called the Youngstown Programming Committee, and their role really is to oversee whatever youth programming is offered at Youngstown. They have a say in it, and the way they do that is, let's say you're a teaching artist or an organization, one that's housed there, they have a set of community criteria that they've adopted, and any program that is offered has to pass through them, and they look at this criteria, of course with some facilitation from, so they just can't be like, well, that's a whack idea, we don't want to do that, so they just can't write off a program wholesale. And then we combine, Youngstown is we just sort of help coordinate the outreach, because we're the space and we're out there in the schools talking about these after-school arts programs. Once they're approved by the youth, then we are able to offer them each quarter, and the third component really is the teaching artists themselves. So they bring the curriculum and the expertise, and what we do is we hope to offer dynamic programming, but has a youth stamp of approval on it. And sorry, I think I'm drifting a little bit, but through the process, what's really great is that the youth themselves start to really see themselves as a part of the center. We've had some incidents of, some criminal incidents there, and we've, of course, tried to apply, involving youth, and tried to apply some restorative justice. And I was really surprised because a lot of the youth in the community we serve have very adverse, and for good reason, relationships with police. But in the matter, they really sort of took ownership and started to recognize that the space was theirs, and there's a real sense of community, and this dynamic is sort of improving. And now the youth, after just some critical, like you said, the relationships were formed, healthy adult relationships with some boundaries just for basic safety, to be real with it, over a course of a year has built this dynamic energy. Our youth programs are exploding, and now our youth are going to other communities and literally taking some of their models and applying them, and with confidence and standing in their power while they do it. I don't know. I think I'll conclude on that, but I don't know if that encourages thoughts. So again, it's really adults really taking the time to go beyond the catchphrase of what empowerment means, and really going inside and really thinking about what that is and how to facilitate that among other people. Again, maybe blurring the line between the organizer and the organized, with real concrete steps, and being a student of, things like youth organizing, and also even nonviolent communication, as to really humanize people and motivate them to really want to feel involved.
So at this point, I feel like I'm a consumer of fascinating conversations, but not in it. And I have to hope I am, and I thank you for that. But I would love to hear your impression of how we can, if we can or should, move more quickly to become a community here now.
Lead us.
I will say that community is a very difficult thing to do.
Absolutely.
It's a beautiful thing to do, but it's not something you can do in an hour. Yeah. You can start, and that's so we can start to build a community, but we won't build one in an hour. We can start it, and that's, I think, what we're doing right now. Right, but I think we have a community, and that we're all here together, and the idea is we can talk together. So I'm going to basically give this over to Philip, who's going to moderate for the next half hour.
John, why don't you continue a while? You spent a lot of time introducing people, and you're very good at this. So.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to have Nick come in here. I think you have many things to say.
Well, maybe not. Now, I address, first of all, I think Roberto's statement about organizing, the first step of any organizing is awareness of the people who want to be organized or create a community. And their awareness is that their lives are being impacted by something outside of themselves. But that awareness itself can lead to depression as opposed to action. So the second element has to be an awareness that they have the ability, either as an individual or working with other people in a community, to change their status. Now, I was involved, like Mark, in Students of Democratic Society. I went to the most conservative college probably in one of the most conservative in the country, is Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And I ended up starting an SDS chapter, heading it up, and then being involved in student government. But the critical thing there was we started with things that affected people's lives immediately, and then took sort of baby steps of you can do something to change your life around, to make some, most people go through life basically asleep. They don't really understand where they're going or why they're going there. It's because they're being moved around by social movements and social forces much greater than them. And the tools that we talk about, whether it's Twitter or social networking, these are tools. They can be basically, gaming and nothing more than that. You have to have content. You have to have an understanding of where you want to go, what kind of society you want to create. You want to be able to use words like social justice and attach it to people's lives and say, this is the thing we want to change. And I'll just end by this. We talk about creating a community here and about, talking about what organizing is. Right now, in this state, 40,000 people are about to be kicked off a basic health plan. That means basically the only people who are going to receive health care right now in Washington State are people who are living in absolute poverty. $18,000 a year for 3 people. That's the people who may receive basic health care. Anybody above that, and believe me, anything above that is not necessarily even middle class. That's still poor. So you talk about Twitter and social networking, things of that sort. That's something that I'd like to see a community come around on and organize around and do something about. But you have to give people awareness that they can do something about it and that it's important. It's important for them.
Can I say something really quick?
I didn't mean to put you down, by the way, about the idea of community. I think we can do it.
Sorry, I just want to say really quickly, I think what you said was right on the money, and that I feel like social networking is a method, and it's also a market, and it's a fastly growing and a very navigable market that's really important to focus on as we continue on and like think about social organizing, but it is not a substitute for community. And that's one of the dangers of social networking, is that people believe it really truly is a substitute for community as opposed to a method to better organize community. Okay, sorry. Should I say that again, or did that make sense?
One thing I do want to say is another guest who was supposed to be here was Lara Davis, who actually works in Youngstown as well. And one reason why I wanted to hear from Lara was that she's doing a lot of issues around trying to raise the profile of race and racism among nonprofits and among people, the kind of organizing we're doing. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, but that's an issue we really have to stay cognizant of.
One of the cliches of the struggles of the 70s and 80s, or the transition, was we moved from a broad movement into a large number of separate struggles. Struggles for racism, struggles about race, struggles about gender, labor struggles, and that every group attained important advances and perfected some of the methods that were developed in the 60s, but that we lost whatever was the broad overarching thread, or at the moment perhaps we haven't found the one yet that starts from those particular struggles as people are in them and unites them together in a more global vision. I'm interested in people's perception about whether that's true or not. Or more specifically, how in the course of bringing people together for a specific struggle, like Robbie's for healthcare, and when he's bringing together a large, diverse number of groups who, as he said to me the other day, you can't talk about something like accountability or torture and have the doctors or everybody together around. You start with a specific struggle. Granted that that's a pragmatic notion. How do we expand from that particular struggle to deal with some of the larger and broader national questions beyond the local, such as the fact that we're a torturing country, that there's no financial accountability at the moment, that we seem to have lost sight of what democracy means, even though people have the people who are passionately committed to the movements are instinctively pushing for more democracy. But how do we engage in some form of a war of ideas through our movements that has a possibility of bringing in people who are not immediately part of the militant culture and are part of the broad public culture, who are asking themselves, what's happening, what's going on, why don't I like what's going on, what's the direction that we should go to?
John handed me the mic, so I guess I'll answer that a little bit. I've been working in the arts for my whole adult life, and also in my whole adult life, I've only experienced movements in that silo vision that you're talking about, which is part of why in my opening statement I talked about the sort of cynicism that I've experienced with a lot of progressive movements. I think a lot of it is born out of, 8 years of George Bush will make you pretty cynical, but I think that what I've seen be successful in my time as an organizer is leveraging the arts as a tool by which to bring diverse stakeholders together around common cause. Youngstown is an arts center, but really it's a community building institution, whether it's environmental stewardship or historic building preservation or affordable housing or public education. Arts is the lens through which all those things are tied together. And Nick asked me to be part of the Cultural Overlay District Advisory Committee, which is essentially a way in which to preserve and incentivize the development of cultural facilities in Seattle, because they're disappearing rapidly. But at the end of the day, what it really is a tool to build community, a sustainable way in which you can create jobs, preserve old buildings, and bring communities together to feel buy-in to a process. But you're using that creative lens and empowering people to find their own way into the conversation through whatever is comfortable to them. And I think, tonight we're sitting in a theater space, in a cultural space, and this facility, Theater Off Jackson, produces theater, hosts conversations like this, and is also a hub for a whole variety of other sort of creative endeavors. And I think that, I don't know if it was the culture wars in the 90s and the contract with America where art became a dirty word and Mapplethorpe photos were scaring parents, and I don't know. But it seems like arts got put into this weird little box, and I've seen it be a very powerful tool to bring diverse stakeholders together. That's my 2 cents about art.
I just had one reaction that I think is important to me, so I'll just put it out there. But I get a little bit tired of hearing about, and I'm part of this generation, I'm 54 years old, so it's, the 60s, as sort of like the start of organization or something. People have been organizing how many thousands of years? And I've been privileged just recently to be in Zimbabwe and South Africa and in France and in Colombia, and I just got back from Paraguay yesterday, or last week. There's people organizing all over the world. It's not something that started in the 60s. And sometimes I've felt in the peace movement, especially in Seattle where I can speak of, it's people of my age that have sort of tried to co-opt the thing and say, we're the guys that really know how to do this, and you young people don't know how to do that. And I think it's just important to recognize that, organizing has been going on forever, and that we need to go back farther than just the 60s. I just wanted to bring that up.
So to comment on that, and I've experienced that as well, being a younger person, where this older generation sometimes feels like, hey, we stopped the Vietnam War, we know what we're doing, listen to us. And I mean, that definitely comes across sometimes, but that's one of the things that I've appreciated about this talk and the talk that I was with Mark on Thursday, where there is this sort of discussion of social networking, and there is this discussion of the model that was used previously, while it worked then, may not necessarily be the best model to apply right now. And aspects of it, I feel, should be applied, such as what you're talking about with the organization on the Delta and the organization you did at Columbia. But to understand also that this discussion, and I think this is a very, very good point for tonight, of how do we leverage that and how do we assimilate that with what else is going on today? And one of the points that Mark brought up on Thursday also was that history is an extremely vital point here. And we need to understand not just what happened in the 60s and what happened in the 70s, but also what other movements have happened historically. The Paris Commune as one, the uprisings of the British religious sects in the 1600s is another, and to see what they did and what they accomplished and where they failed and where the 60s movement failed is extremely important. Paul?
Yeah, I was just thinking how it sort of struck me all of a sudden when you, I'm Paul Loeb. I do books on citizen activism. And it struck me a second ago, when I think one of the things you were raising about just the lineage made me think of it, that we're whatever we are, an hour and 20 minutes in, and no one has actually mentioned, other than that, the depression of the Bush era, that we actually just came out of 4 months ago, where an organizing model that basically combined on the ground and new technologies shifted a presidential race and a bunch of Senate races, with a presidential candidate who actually got a start as a student organizer in the anti-apartheid movement. And that's not to say that everything should get left to Obama, but it sure is to say that there's this huge amount of people who participated in it, who took their first steps into political organization, or in some cases resumed after lapses, after all those years, and that we ought to be looking in part at some of those successes from 4 months ago, because that's immediate reason. And again, I mean, the co-founder of Facebook helped design that social networking site of Obama, and there were people knocking on the ground in the most remote rural communities, and it actually did successfully join those too. The question, it seems to me, is how you, which I don't necessarily have a great answer to, but how you then create an independent movement that can levy pressure on Obama the way, to use just one example, the civil rights movement pulled Kennedy and King from very reluctant arm's length, distancing, go slow, put the brakes on, to eventually Johnson putting his political clout behind the civil rights bill to help pass it, and the voting rights bill, knowing the political costs that the Democrats would pay, which they did pay when he said they'd lose the South for a generation. So it just seems to me, and the same thing is true with the labor movement and Roosevelt, that to not have that sort of, to me, very hopeful reality be a sort of central part of the discussion. I mean, it makes us, this is a just very different, having discussion now is very different than, a year and a half ago or 2 years or 3 years in the heart of, the Bush disaster. So.
Right, and to extend that question, maybe Mark could comment, it took the right 40 years to go from Goldwater's defeat to their absolute triumph and we hope ruin. What's the 40-year plan that we have? I'm not saying we should design it, but there has been a tendency to think in terms of winning this election because we can't afford to lose it in another 4 years. What is it that that goal that people, Tom Hayden is writing a book called The Long 60s at the moment. So thinking in the long term, add that to what's the thread that brings the separate movements together.
I'd like Mark to comment on that, but before he does, I'd also like to talk about briefly, one of the reasons why we bring up the 60s so much is that when you were in the 60s, this didn't happen, at least not enough, where there were people from the 40s and the 30s talking to people in the 60s. And part of the reason for that was that the 60s people were bullheaded and stupid. But for another, part of it was also that a lot of the people in the 40s and the 30s, 40s, and 50s had been driven to ground by McCarthyism and a variety of other things. And there was a disconnect there.
There was a thing called the Free University in Seattle, and it was all over the country in the 60s, and there was a lot of communication in those free universities between people from the 30s and even the 20s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. Any of you remember those free universities? Were you old? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So there was some communication, but you're right in terms of
overall.
Someone right here wants to talk too, I know back there.
I think there's often a tendency, my name's Vivian Sharples, I think there's a tendency to think that there's sort of one way that's the best way to build mass movements, and I like some of the work of Bill Moyer looking at stages of social movements, and I think I found it helpful because I have been a sort of very direct action kind of person, part of maybe an action faction kind of place, but I also recognize there's important places of all the other kinds of activism as well, and that it doesn't help, I think, when we start saying, well, this way is the right way, that way isn't. And so every movement goes through all these stages. You need some people who work on these issues, whatever is happening in the rest of the society, and then some people are only going to join in when it reaches a certain tipping point and they see lots of people involved, like, say, the environmental movement now has reached a tipping point, clearly, in some ways at least. And so I just think there's something here where we're thinking there's just sort of the only way, but there are many ways to do this. And anyway, read his work.
There's a model of militants versus fellow travelers in movements, if you can divide them down. The militants are the people who go to all the meetings, their whole life is built around it. A fellow traveler might donate online, they might show up at a demonstration, and I think in the 60s one thing that happened is there was a tendency for each group to start, at some point in moments of crisis, to despise the other. The militants would look at the fellow travelers and say, they're not willing to go all the way and put their bodies on the line like Che. The fellow travelers would look at the militants and say they're closet Stalinists who are finally coming out and revealing their true nature. But in terms of keeping together a broad movement, and I think I'm agreeing with Vivian there in what you're saying, maybe if the 60s was the time when the militant was idealized, maybe we can come up with an idealized notion of fellow traveling where we all come from different subject positions. We all are interested in certain specific struggles, but we're all walking along the same road with equal status to be considered and to be heard and to articulate the goal that we're going through, rather than having some particular group being the vanguard. Thoughts on that, Peter?
Well, I was thinking about being an 18-year-old kid, upwardly mobile, coming out of Everett, Washington, and going to Stanford. And this was 1970, and we organized at Everett High School. And we made this incredible alliance between the shop kids and the honors kids, the few kids that were going on to college. And it was powerful. We actually had write-in candidates, and we elected the Student Rights Party. So anyways, we kind of had our own voice, and it was powerful. We had rallies in the street in Everett that they hadn't seen for 20, 30 years. So I go to Stanford, and it seemed like I was against the war, and a whole bunch of us just wanted to stop the damn thing. But the minute you would go to a rally or open your mouth up, you had all the professional honchos up there, like I would say, I want to stop the war now, and they go, that's incorrect, man. It's stop imperialist war now, right? People's war is okay. And so there's like, there's something about not doing that and opening things up and having faith in people's creativity. I mean, right now I go between two communities. I go between Seattle Central, where I teach, and I've got students from everywhere, and they've got their own issues, and they're trying to figure out how to address those. The problem with teaching them is you start talking about global warming and the economic crash, and it seems so totalistic that they go, fuck it, let's just go drink beer, man. They become paralyzed and they become cynical. So you got to make that connection between the big thing and what's going on in their daily life, and make them feel comfortable that they can articulate that. See, the key thing for me for organizing is getting people engaged in the process. So when we had Students Against War at Central a few years ago, we had Pat Buchanan type Republicans, kids, vets coming back. We had, the only point of unity was you were against the war. But then we got an outside Leninist group that came in, you have to support the Iraqi resistance, and the vets started screaming at him, what do you mean, Al-Qaeda? Who are you talking about? And all of a sudden, the kids who just wanted to stop the war started going, hell with this, man, I'm out of here. So somehow we have to realize that people are always capable and organizing their own life, and somehow the organizing has to facilitate that thing that's already going on somehow, and make those connections. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No. So, was there someone else in queue? Yeah, I think one thing I'm very interested in bringing up and making, and from that point, facilitating from a point that makes sense and it motivates someone, And when you said there's an explosion that takes place, that's that initial explosion, and that's not a bad thing, that's natural, it's a moment that catalyzes you, builds your passion. But when when people seeking social change, they get almost addicted to that feeling, and then what you have is they remain to that last stage that you articulated, which is, what was it, existential, what was your theory? Yeah, existential politics.
Existential politics is, I'm doing it to validate.
Exactly. Right, exactly. Because you've kind of, you're longing for that feeling of being attached to a meaning and being very certain about it. And something that, just to back it up a little bit, I was raised in South San Diego, and, I was born to two parents that were basically Chicano gang members, and luckily, my father, stayed, and mother, they played roles, and they were not gone or invisible by any means, but there was struggle, there was poverty, dependence on public assistance and whatnot. And not till I went to college did I understand, even though I was raised in a place with a critical mass of, Latinos, like some of my history, and I had to go to Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington to learn a little bit more about my people, you know what I'm saying? And there I was catalyzed by Mecha, which has been, as many people probably know, really characterized as what they call the basically like Mexican Nazis, wanting to probably, to almost, they really emphasize this aspect of the reconquista, like really like Mexicans take over everything, it's like, it is really ridiculous. And the group has also evolved, but, there I had my first kind of a taste of identity politics, and it was almost like a fire was given to me that I didn't know before, and it was powerful, and it was meaningful, and I'll never regret that, I'll never renounce it, regardless of where I end up. But I did reach a point where almost like, especially men, even though women did most of the group work in the movement, which I think is also another key issue, women were the backbone of, especially, I mean, as far as like, the Chicano movement, and men took the microphone. Irony. But so I guess what I was trying to get to was that eventually, as I progressed, people were essentializing the meaning of Chicano and the struggle to a degree where me wanting to go and work across lines of race, or to bother to, I walked across, I remember, and I wanted to go talk to a Minuteman. People thought that was crazy talk, at a rally. But, and it was mostly men clinging on to their power in this group, wanted to block me from that window of a new view, of a new possibility, And I guess, I want to wrap it up, is that anger and guilt, whether it's communities of color or white folks coming from places of privilege, are natural phases in trying to build a movement, but they are not, you can't stay there, and you can't cling to that and guard it. And I think that's something that I see in even, in working in the nonprofit world. There's people that, a lot of them of your generation, unfortunately, are clinging to a power that they fought very hard for and are really not facilitating the transfer of leadership and giving the tools and accepting innovative tools from the younger generation. Likewise, in the grassroots movements, I tell people that I'm finishing my degree in public affairs, and there's already that sets off a trail of thoughts of sellout and whatever, and we can't collaborate, and it's really unfortunate. So again, not clinging to anger, guilt as really what they become sources of power that you cling on to, and we don't work across sectors and innovate, which I think is a key word as we move forward. Because I feel like we're in a time where we don't have the human and social capital to write anyone off, as weird as that sounds. So the more time you can visualize yourself in almost like the utter opposite of where you're at, the better off and more sharp and innovative you're staying. I have to think about middle American, flag-waving, hardworking, hunter in, I don't know, in a Midwest state. I should be thinking about that and where they're coming from in their life circumstances as I inform my theory to move forward.
Well, Alberto, that's a good point. Thanks a lot. You're going to add to the conversation?
Yeah. I guess one of the things we can look forward to, people were talking about history, is recent history, and I know a lot of young people might not have been around for this, but it was the WTO that we experienced in Seattle. Basically, it was a movement that was heard around the world, and it started a lot of things happening in Europe and other countries. But it was a coming together of everybody, networking that was going on under the radar, but there was something in the wind, and people picked it up and moved together all at one in disparate places across the country and across the world. And I feel like we're at that time right now where everything is hitting everybody in all places at all times, and there's no such thing as apathetic students right now, because they're feeling things in their lives that's changing them forever. And and just drawing on what people said, Obama had somebody that used the new social technology to move towards a certain goal. And I think what's lacking here is, what is the goal that we want? What kind of new society do we want? How do we stop unemployment? How do we stop the cutbacks that are eventually going to kill people if they don't get medical care? There are a lot of oppressing things that are going on right now, but how do we crystallize that goal and put it out there where everybody right now feels like their life has been changed, has been moved, not only in the United States but across the world, and we have the opportunity to do that right now, to make the breakthrough by crystallizing the goal and putting it out there and getting people organized. And it may happen in disparate ways, such as the WTO, but we're in that period right now where change is happening whether we move or not. Right now. So again, I guess the question is calling, like, it sounds like we've got all the organizing tools. We're talking about how to use them, but again, the thing that needs to be clear is what kind of goal, what kind of precise goal can we use to move forward and to get a lot of people to move towards, such as what happened in the WTO that sparked a movement across the world.
Mark would say that in the 60s, one of the problems was people took a tactic for a strategy, weather, but it even became worse. The tactic became the goal, armed struggle. It may, in fact, be also that when one talks technology, the danger now is that one takes this technology as the goal rather than a tactic towards whatever it is, as you're saying, that we are what our goal is a broad movement, which we seem to have to define more precisely, both in terms of institutionally, what sort of democratic institutions do we need that we don't have. I want to bring in some people who haven't talked. You were you had something to...
You said something about people being able to articulate, and that made me think a little bit about these social networking sites and the tipping point that we're talking about, and how I think that there's a tipping point that occurs when people are upset about something but they can't articulate to others what it is that is making them mad, what it is that's making them upset, and when they can suddenly sit down with their friends and have a debate about it, and they can articulate and they can draw in all of these other aspects that are influencing it. And I think
talking about, but I think intentionally you've seen it happen either, like the healthcare debate is a perfect example where we've changed the way we talk about it, not because we're talking about something different, but because we're talking about it in a way that is accessible and meets people where they are and engages them in the dialogue, engages them in the conversation, and shows them their common cause that we all have. And expanding that concept to this larger progressive social movement is key.
There's an interesting fact that confirms that. They compare it as...
This works.
So we're back. There is a comparison between right-wing think tanks and liberal think tanks. Liberal think tanks do specific research and provide it to activists around specific issues. Right-wing think tanks devote a lot of their efforts towards what they call the war of ideas, targeting the media, the public policy. The question is, what is the ideology? And I don't mean that in a bad way, as is the kind of hardcore, fanatical notion of ideology we have, but what are the ideas that we stand for? What kind of narrative do we need to spend more time along with our specific struggles to broaden them into a narrative or a story that brings in those people who are mad as hell and don't want to take it anymore, but don't know what to do or what the vision of the more democratic society is that they are fighting for?
Can we go to Alex? Yeah. I just want to move back to Mark. I want to get your feedback on something soon.
So I'd like to step back maybe a little bit farther here, and I think it's worth considering whether the model of activism that we're talking about works at all. I think that there are some really good reasons to believe that, in fact, we have had essentially no successes. That we talk about things that are successful achievements of small goals, but are not successful fundamental realignments of a situation. There's this really great, does everyone here know who Van Jones is? Yeah. Okay.
Maybe you should reintroduce him.
He's a great activist. He just took a gig in the Obama administration. He's sort of best known for his work on green jobs. He has a really terrific speech that you can get online that he gave up at the Hollyhock Leadership Institute, where he talks about how activism is funded in the U.S. and talks about how, without doing his whole thing, basically that in order to get money to do activism, which is how all activism really works, is somebody pays for it. You have to come up with an articulation of a problem that is really definable and narrow, right? And then explain why you are the best person to solve that, and that when it's solved, it will bring a profound change. And that's how you get the grants and the membership support and so on. And he says, if this was actually true and you read all of the proposals and all of the membership pitches and everything, you'd think that we were already living in a socialist utopia, right? If we'd actually achieved everything that we were supposed to have achieved from these little, these individual goals, that we would in fact have done something much bigger than we have. And I think that it's really worth, first of all, it's worth listening to that speech because he gives that point a lot better than I just did. But also, there's this larger question of what is our win scenario? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve, and what would far enough be? And I don't think that fundamentally the model that we've set up is designed to get us there.
Let me ask a quick question. Is that because it's too incremental? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think it is based on this idea that, I think in part it's based, one of the problems is it's based on the idea that the problem is dividable into small issues, and that if you achieve success on a number of small issues, it will add up to success overall.
I agree. Mark, you want to add to it?
Well, all right, then I'll talk. The thing that actually, Sabrina, but the one question I have about that is that Nick had talked about those thousands of people who are about to lose their health benefits. And you were talking before about really urgent issues, and there are always urgent issues, really urgent issues. And I think this goes back to Mark's life in the Vietnam War. I mean, dealing with the Vietnam War and dealing with issues of racism and poverty, is that it seems there's stuff we have to do right now or yesterday, and it's really critical. And why the fuck are we sitting here? Why are we not out on the street? But the question is, the kind of organizing that really has to happen is slow and long-term.
40 years.
How do you reconcile slow, long-term organizing with the fact that every moment you look around, something really horrible is about to happen and has to be dealt with now? How do you deal with that?
I think the answer is that you solve problem if you get a small group of people together and you see an immediate gain, so you don't have that burnout. So I know that the big mass movement issues are really important and the goals are really important, but where you can actually get dirt under your fingernails and do something right away and build a movement among your neighbors, sometimes is the most powerful thing, because you can realize a gain and everybody can see it, and then you move to the bigger question.
Sabrina wanted to say something.
Well, to bounce off what you're talking about and organizing your neighbors, I'm very interested in hearing some comments on community-based media and how we shape our narrative, how we talk about these ideas on the local level. And in complete disclosure, I do work at a community radio station.
Well, one thing that I would greatly recommend on that front is that all of us ought to be supporting KBCS, which is the community radio station here, and make it as powerful as possible. But if I could, Sabrina, not beyond saying that, I think one of the things that I lacked as an activist in the 60s was understanding the arc of history. I think that I failed to listen to my forebears, the people who struggled in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and learn the lessons from them. We were the new left, and we were almost rejecting the old left. And I think that was a terrible failure on my part to understand the arc of history. Dr. King talked about the arc of history, and that the arc of history over the long term always bends towards justice. And that we then begin to understand where we fit in that arc of history without overplaying who we are. We are one speck in this long arc of history, and we have to learn, and I'm deeply regret. It was only after, I acted in what I now look back and think was a pretty arrogant way. It was only after that I got to know some of the people who fought the McCann Commission here, who led the struggles of the 1930s and 1940s, who knew something about how to move things forward. And while I wouldn't have adopted what they did wholesale, I could have learned a hell of a lot from them that I failed to learn, in part because I just thought I had it. I thought I understood it, and I was wrong. But I do think that part of what we have to see in terms of those smaller struggles that were mentioned is how they fit into the arc of history. And if I could just talk a little bit, because we've mentioned it several times, healthcare. The first universal healthcare bill, legislation that was ever introduced in this country was 1934. We are now, 75 years later, on the cusp of making history. We're on the cusp of winning that. What an enormous opportunity that is for us. And what a difference it's going to make in people's lives. And what does it mean when people feel like they've won a victory? How inspiring is that to continue to move forward? So many of us felt the joy of the victory of the election of Barack Obama. I mean, we were crying. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. I wasn't allowed to go in the railway station on the colored side. When I did, a policeman came up to me and said, "You can't drink from that fountain." And we just put Barack Obama and Michelle Obama and their children in the White House. That's incredible. And now we're on the cusp of winning something that our foremothers and forefathers have fought for 75 years. And what will it mean to us if we achieve that victory in terms of envisioning what we can do beyond that? Maybe we really can take away the power of the multinational corporations to control our government through campaign finance reform.
Wake up, Mark.
Thank you. Are you with me, brother?
Oh, no, it's so beautiful. I'm just taking
I mean, I just think that we have to understand
mesmerized.
What a lovely and exciting historical moment we are in, and that. Sure, we're going to work on different things. I love what you're working on. I love what Sabrina's doing at KBCS. And every chance I get to go in there and raise money for them, I do it, you know? And I love the work that you're doing with young people because I understand how important that is and what Toby is doing with BUS. And we get to work together. You know, we get to do this shit together, and it's fun, isn't it, Toby? You know, so, I mean, there is all that we are at this wonderful, historic moment of hope, where we can achieve some things that we did not even think was possible 2 years ago. So, yes, we have a vision. We want a more democratic society. We want a socially just society. We want an economically just society. And we're going to win those things by winning these little battles.
Yeah.
The battle for health care, the battle for a green economy, the battle for all of these things that we're working for are part of giving people the sense of what their power is and what we can do.
Right on. Hear, hear. I was just kind of wanted to speak on going off of this, but you know, having conversations with in regard to like people that were just incredible people in whatever field they took on. You know, when you think of the Albert Einstein types and Stephen Hawking, it's kind of like it's very interesting to me that I know maybe this is, you know, I don't mean to get too wishy-washy, but those kind of people that went to like the outer boundaries of their intelligence and their work and dove in, almost went all that way just to realize that there was so much more to know and there's an endless frontier in front of them. And I think that's something that people concerned with peace and justice can really take from, in that we are responsible as individuals to cultivate our what our sense of justice and peace are, and reconcile those on an everyday basis. And I'm not, you know, and none of us are off the hook for that work. And you will never have all the answers. And that's okay, you know? And I don't know, I just feel, you know, social change is not a reversal of roles or putting someone in a certain position. It's an individual thing. So just to acknowledge the individual side of it, I guess, is that we're each responsible for educating ourselves as to what, and building our sense of justice and our definition of that, and also of peace, and realizing that I don't feel like they have to be mutually exclusive if you really work at it, you know, and inviting that issue, like especially around something I think of race, is that people feel like they have the right to stay hurt and stay angry over that, but I don't feel like that's a right, you know. It's in anything. There's like I think James Baldwin once said, "There's nothing so scary as being divested of a crutch," you know, and thinking about that frontier. And I think someone said earlier is that I challenge everyone to be visionary and almost be like, you know, not just a vision for when like being post-conflict, like what comes after your key issue is solved, what happens then, and that way you're thinking onward. You know, almost be challenging everyone to think of themselves as a visionary, not in a pompous sense, but just project yourself beyond the goal.
Let me make an effort to reformulate Alex's challenge to what we call the model of a familiar model. On one level, we have ground level activism that's focused on specific issues, the kind of narrow issues, the granted issues that Alec talks about. On another level, on a kind of broad level, we have those big words: social justice, democracy, with at the moment no content, or with a kind of content that maybe varies as each person hears them. I'd like to suggest that there's an intermediate level, which I'll call the institutional level. I think it's a level that people were in the 60s didn't even bother to address, but which we have to. It deals with questions about instant runoff voting versus the kind of system we have, a first past the post. It has to do with things like the tenure of Supreme Court justices, which is lifetime here, which creates a kind of anti-democratic gear, as opposed to, say, like 12 years in Germany, where people can get in. When one examines democratic institutions, it deals with a two-party system, or what Gore Vidal would call a hydra-headed single party, the kind of monopoly of politics that it has, versus the potentiality of something different. It deals with the fact of whether, if you have a constitution that is virtually unrevisable, how that compares with a democracy like Sweden, which was able to totally rewrite its constitution in 1976. All of these levels, which are fleshing out what a more democratic society would mean, the role of a Senate, which grants small states the ability to put veto power over what the majority of the country would accept. Fleshing out those particular things over a 40-year plan. Obviously, you can't do this now, but what is our goal? What kind of democracy do we want? Have we worked on it? Is this a valuable route that we can take that we haven't? I posed the question. I accept any response.
So, okay, I've got a lot of conflicting and disparate ideas running through my head right now, and I'm sure pretty much everyone here does as well. And I think that's okay. And applying that to the idea of what's the end goal or what's the win scenario is, there isn't one for me as a youth coming up. There isn't going to be a day where I say, well, my work is done. Right. That's it. Thank you. I wouldn't want that day, because the point of democracy and the point of freedom is that I don't agree with you, and you don't agree with me, and I want that. Because it's through that sort of discussion and that mixing of ideas that we actually grow as a culture, as a species, as an entity. So I don't like to view it as, I mean, I used to when I was a little younger, and I don't know, I'm still fleshing all this out, but I don't like to view it as, this is what I want. Yes, I would like a parliamentary system where you have a more fluid government. But to me, that's just a stepping stone. And the idea of an end goal is somewhat self-defeating, because I'm not going to get there, and I think that's okay. And another thing, one of the disparate ideas I had was, it was mentioned about the arrogance of it. And I think that's a very vital point, that you can be arrogant and recognize that you were, and then move beyond that arrogance. And I'm not saying this because my teacher's right here, but I read a piece by Stephen Jay Gould where he was discussing social evolution as compared to Darwinian evolution. And one of the points that he brought up about social evolution was that it's reversible. So with Darwinian evolution, you're stuck with what you got. Social evolution, hey, you know what? We make a mistake. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we're arrogant and we do things that are destructive, but we can turn that around. So it's great to just throw out these ideas and to use the social networking where you can have just, I mean, if you look at the internet, the explosion of information right now is obscene. But that's fantastic. And we can make those mistakes, learn from them, and keep going. And that's just what's running through my head right now.
Is anybody sitting here right now saying, damn it, I wish they'd talk about X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, well,
So all right, so we've got those. So let's prioritize those. We have one back here, and then Bert, and who else? Nick. John, and Nick, and back here. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to have an order: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And 6. A self-moderating crowd. Remember your numbers.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Lee, and I'm in the International Socialist Organization. And I just want to say thank you very much to everybody who organized this. This is a great event. A couple points. First of all, people have said this before, but I think we're at a tremendous time in history. Not only are we in the middle of an economic crisis at the same time that people have a great deal of hope because of Obama and the end of the Bush regime and so forth, but we're also in a period where this generation of people what are known as the millennials, the people under 30, are actually the most progressive and radical generation that has ever existed in terms of their social attitudes, their multiracial character, et cetera. I think there's a lot of potential today, and I think we ought to be very optimistic about that. And then just to get real quickly on the question of vision, I really like what Robbie said about the connection between the long-range goals of social justice and the short-range issues. And just to flesh that out a little bit more from my viewpoint, I think a democratic society means a society in which the whole economy is run democratically. That is, ordinary people directly control their workplaces, and they plan how the economy is run so that we make sure that all the wealth of the society is used for the needs of people rather than for corporate profit. And I think we ought to have that as a vision along with all the other organizing we're doing. So I think it's important, along with the issue organizing we're doing, to actually build an explicitly socialist movement that works within that and through that and alongside it to give that kind of overall vision for a fundamentally democratic society.
Cool, thank you. Who was two? Very good. That's...
Thank you.
Got it.
My name is Bert Sachs. I'd like to try and take a stab at ideology and 40-year vision. One thing that's troubled me a lot is I've been to different events over the past 15 years I've been in Seattle, is the extent to which people try and cultivate my anger towards whomever. And I think that's the fundamental change that I would like to see happening in this movement. And people talk about Martin Luther King. I remember him talking about Bull Connor. And he didn't say, we need to hate this policeman who's freeing the dogs on us. He said, we need to see him as a poor, confused brother that needs our help. And my own experience has been going to Iraq to see the children that were dying from the sanctions period for 7 years. And now it's been almost another 7 years. That hasn't ended. We're in there even deeper and killing more people. And I would come back from Iraq and I'd say, you know, I think we killed 500,000 children because we demonized one man. We hated one man. That was Saddam Hussein. And so the lesson I learned that I try and speak about, this is my best understanding, is that if we really want to work for that 40-year vision of the future, we can't demonize anybody. And I see people will often shake their heads. And then I put the hard one in, which is that includes Dick Cheney. And yeah, exactly. Okay, yeah. And there it is. I said it.
Okay, before we go to number 3, which was, Alex was 3, Hollis was 3, but before we do, Robbie's going to pass around some flyers around healthcare march on May 30th. So, here you go.
Oh, word.
Oh, got it.
Word. Let's see. I was going to talk about, in regards to your comment about, and I suppose that tacks on really wonderfully to the comment that was just made. But how we see it, like 40-year plans talking about like changing the Constitution, changing things that have been so kind of statically historicized in my frame as things that are almost unchangeable. And I know that nothing is unchangeable and everything is in flux. But I think that what was mentioned before is something that really hits home for me as somebody who is both an artist and a young person, and additionally one who organizes and facilitates younger people in enabling them to take on leadership abilities as well, and really cultivating it. I suppose they're like, I think of them as my youth, and I call them my kids, but they're really like, we only have like 4 years separation between, and which is really, when I think about it, it's like, the roles that we take on within our own youth generation, I think have been very instructive, like especially when I come into conversations like this, where I realize that, there's so much to be learned historically, and there's so much to be learned from the young people now. Even I feel like I learn enormous amounts of information every day from youth that are 2 years, 3 years younger than me, and I hope to be able to enable them to take on the same kind of like both confidence and the I guess, the courage to be visionary, as Alberto called it. But what I wanted to talk about, especially in terms of community-based media, is essentially alternate institution formation, which I think is what you were discussing earlier in terms of like how we can fundamentally change institutions and industry and industrial complexes, as I see it as well. Sorry. And like basically, instead, I think I see for myself is implementing alternate models, institutional models, as opposed to going within and taking a long and patient and very thought through and very theoretical, but possibly not necessarily tied into the urgency of what I witness and what I witness in the youth that I work with. You know, it'd be difficult for me to sit my 16-year-old kids down and be like, okay guys, like we're gonna fundamentally change the electoral college. Like that's what we're gonna do. You know what I mean? Like there's 4 schools are closing and there's like a plan to put in a prison for hundreds of millions of dollars, like in the neighborhoods in which they live. It's really difficult to try to involve people in these long-range, long-view, democratic kind of institution changes, which is not to say that it's not valuable at all or possible or something that we should be working towards. But I think I'd like to see some sort of middle ground, and that's truly why I feel so impassioned about the work that I do at Youngstown, because I truly believe that we are forming an institution wherein we authentically empower young people to lead themselves. And that's something that I didn't personally receive when I was 16 years old, and something that I'm only now realizing is possible. And I'm like, if I can feel that I have the optimism and the idea that it's possible for me to really lead my own self and lead my community in an authentic and tangible way, and change policy and be able to change our communities and enable our communities and make our communities more equitable and just. And equity is, it's not this whole long range, like off into the distance, never touch the horizon. Like equity is real, and equity comes in healthy communities, and equity comes with resources. And I see those possibilities happening. So I guess I'm less, and I'm not saying that it's not, like, I really see the value in thinking 40 years ahead and changing systems. But for me, in my place, like in my historical moment, I suppose, as a young person working with young people, it's a lot more immediate for me, and I think it's a lot more possible, personally. That's how I feel about it.
Can I pose a question? Is it possible that you're a member of 2 movements at the same time without knowing it? That one movement is what you're doing, essentially, in your community, which no one will ask you to give up, you know, which is certainly valuable work, but that you're also part of this other movement that's forming unconsciously and that hasn't been as articulated yet, and it's the 40-year movement that's connecting your specific movement to whatever larger goals are being articulated.
I mean, hopefully I'll be moving for another like 80 years, is the hope. So it's like a 40-year movement, it's a 60-year movement, it's a 53-year movement, it's a 2-year movement, it's a 2-month movement. I don't know. Like, I feel like we can't come, like, it's difficult for us to ascribe to notions like that, because nobody signs a contract to those things. Nobody, you know what I mean? It's difficult because it's a lot more. I feel how can I say this? It's comprehensive, and it's almost, is prismatic an adjective? Yeah, it's prismatic. In the sense that it's not, for me, it's not important to articulate a thesis statement of my generation. For me, it's important that people of my generation feel empowered enough to make true, tangible change in ways that advance equity.
That is a thesis statement.
Okay, word. Well, then that's it. Well, that was easy. Okay.
Very cool. Were you gonna? So I mean, Nick's 4, and then
I'm 4.
You're
Is this
5,
working?
and you're 6. Good. Got it. Go, Nick.
Okay.
Okay,
It is working. I just want to toss sort of 2 thoughts out while affecting this framework we're talking about. The first addresses, I like what you said about there's not necessarily a specific end goal, is what I heard you say. And that's counter to the idea, I suppose, of you know, what's the ideology or what's the broader theoretical framework we're going in. The first point I want to make is that we're not necessarily trying to tell people that there's going to be a utopia at point X. There's not going to be like a perfect society. The path there, though, is a democratic one, and it's a process one, and that's the one that addresses your point, too, of having alternative to what we have now, dominant institutions that allow not just youth, but anyone to be empowered over their own lives. So it's almost reminiscent of the Port Huron statement, participatory democracy, where what got me involved as basically a working class kid first time going to college. So it's a process thing, something that we feel that will go on more than 40 years, hopefully 100 years. It'll be something that we become part of. The second thought I want to share, and it's a bit off from what we've said, but something I've been thinking about for a long time. We haven't really talked about American culture. It's one thing that no one's really talked about. America has a unique culture. I know everyone knows, for instance, that we don't have a parliamentary system. We don't have national health care. We're so different from the rest of the world. But there's a reason for that. This country was basically founded by people who are individuals who are out there hustling. And that has been conquering, hustling, but it was like, I want what's for me. And as hard as we all try to think about social justice and community and things of that sort, we are swimming in this ocean of individualism that permeates everything we do, even when we don't think about it. I mean, we're a nation of religions, but we're founded by people who could choose the religion they wanted. Individual choice dominates just about everything. Even when you think about the civil rights movement, it was the individual choice of going where you wanted to go. Now, just to follow up on that, what really makes it difficult, and the thing we have to overcome, and it reflects the first part about participatory democracy, what other cultures have done, is democracy is not just voting. It's not just exercising your individual right to vote. But democracy is realizing that you're democratizing the public resources. And that's what other countries have been much more successful to doing. The community at large has recognized that the resources are shared by the community at large. They are the public resources, and they're democratized. They're not corporatized as what we see happening in this country. And that's the struggle that we're engaged in.
Cool. So we've got 4, 5, and then Alex is 6.
That's a beautiful thing, because what Nick just said, because I really think that we need to have those universal places that we come together. The Great Recession and the great hope of this spring, to me, also has as a corollary the great fear. The arc of my life has seen every progressive movement that I wanted to believe in, that I believed in, truncated, crushed, taken away from us over the last 40 years. And so the great fear that I have is that the Twitters, this great media, is a great trap. I'm fearful that unless we come together with some universal, it's not the universal theory, it's this nonviolent, progressive concept and way of being in place, in culture, on this planet. We need that arc. We need that 40-year vision, at least, to hold us together and to do rear guard action, because I don't trust the bastards. They're very, very good at what they do. I've seen them take us down. We have to come together, and I think it's both deeds. I really believe I'm a ballot activist trying to be a bioregional planner. I think that we need to both get dirty, but we damn well better be smart.
I will say one of the interesting contradictions of the way the world works is that the people who tend to Twitter and blog the most are the people who actually, except for a couple of geeks way up in the corner, are the people who are actually engaged face-to-face the most. So John, you had a question, a comment.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this room, and there's an incredible amount of institutional knowledge about movements and organizations. And probably the highlight of my life was WTO in '99, and then the follow-up in 2000 in Seattle, just as far as organizing and seeing something actually, you know, happen, some results. And I'm a fisherman and a sustainable food democracy activist. That's most of the work I do. But I've been on a lot of boards. I've been in a lot of organizations. I've been, you know, involved in a lot of groups. And one of the questions I wanted to ask, you know, and we're looking at when do you walk away and quit and move on to something else with a movement or an organization. And, you know, with movement, when you look at the long-term struggle and the ebb and flow of movements, you know, when do you compromise to keep movements alive? And when do you hold your ground and walk away? And I'm just looking for some wisdom and advice, you know, what different people's ideas on things that they've been involved in over the years and where they've had to make those decisions and what's good strategy.
Alex, I'm not sure if you're going to respond to that. You were next. You were next.
I certainly don't feel qualified to respond to that. You know, one of the challenges, it seems to me, is that each of us comes with our own experiences, our own set of knowledge, and we all live in different worlds, right? We all have different realities that we're trying to negotiate between. And one of the things that, as I was listening to you, Phil, earlier, redefining it, and then as I've listened to the conversation happen, that occurred to me is that the reality that I find myself living in and working from, I don't really feel is reflected in the conversation in this room. And one of the biggest reasons why is because the work I do involves a timeline. And it's a very unforgiving timeline. It's a set of deadlines that are absolute and imposed by forces outside of our control. You know, we live on a very finite planet. We are already beyond the carrying capacity of the planet in terms of our use of the biosphere. We know that we are heating that planet at a much more rapid rate than we believed even 2 years ago. We know that by 2050, we actually will have made a series of choices that leave us with one of two futures. One of them is pretty damn unthinkable. It's you know, a future where we've committed ourselves to roughly 6 degrees of centigrade of warming on the planet, where we've committed ourselves to losing half of all the species on the planet, where we have about 300 million environmental refugees. This isn't science fiction. This is what we know will happen. Right? The smartest people on the planet with the best models are saying this is what's going to happen. Or we have this other future, which is not unthinkable, but which is currently unimaginable. Right, which is a future in which we've managed to figure out how to take what we have now and redefine it fundamentally, redefine our prosperity so that we are living within the boundaries of what the planet can accept, and in a way that we can share with the other billions of people who are coming up and demanding their own prosperity, which is no mean feat. I mean, it involves reducing our material and energy use by 90 to 95% in the next 20 years. You know, that's not a small thing. But I also think that we can't do that without fundamentally changing a lot of the systems that we engage with, whether we're talking about the way that we value one another's work and the natural world, the way that we interact with each other in terms of governance and democracy, you know, media. I mean, I could go on, and everyone in this room knows this stuff. But I guess that one of the things that seems a little surreal to me sometimes is that in conversations about activism, there's often this sense that sort of like, that you get points for trying. You know, that if we make a really good try at it and we achieve something, that's something achieved and good. And I find myself living in a world and working with a lot of people where we know that achieving something is failure, and failure is absolute. And that we are, you know, the metaphor that a lot of people use is we're going very fast down a mountain road that turns really sharply. And turning part of the way doesn't help, you know? And so when I, you know, and I'm sorry for going on, but you know, when I say that I think that we're failing, that's the light that in my mind we're failing in. And I guess I would just be interested in hearing whether to other people there is a sense that we are in a unique moment and that moment is different than previous moments, and maybe we need to reinvent our whole approach in order to deliver the kind of order of magnitude of change that we are told we need.
Okay, so look, so hold on a minute. What we have here is a situation where we have a finite set of time in this space as well. About 35 minutes, every single body has to be out of this space. Every single piece of furniture has to be moved back. So, and I think that the comment before about smaller communications may make a lot of sense. So I want to give people time to be able to do that before we have to have all our bodies out. So what I think we should do is you had a comment, right? And then Roger, you had a comment, and I don't know if we'll get to you, John. I just don't know. I think we should do. And Paul, you spoke, but I think you can. I think we might have to go.
If you don't get to it,
and I want to actually have a couple of contact URLs and possible actions for us to take before the end. So we have about maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then we should start just convening and talking so that we're all out the door by 7 o'clock. It's the reason why is that there's a theater downstairs. Mm-hmm. If we're here after 7, the people who are listening to the theater are going to hear us. So that's why it's critical that we leave. Paul, you had something, right? Yeah. Okay. So what? Well, 2 Pauls actually. So this gentleman is waiting, so he will talk, and then I think we'll go with the 2 Pauls and Roger, and then would you like to say some closing words?
Oh, come on. Come on, Mark.
Okay, Mark, I think it'd be great. But Paul, Roger, and then we'll wrap it up. So go ahead.
My name's Rick, but I could change my name to Paul if you'd like. There's just a few things that I'll try to make just as separate things, and I'll say them and I'll let you just think about them as I think what the next thing is that I wanted to say. I'll try to speak slow enough that Mark and other old codgers like myself can understand what I'm saying, and fast enough so that the young people can still not fall asleep. The first thing is that in 8 days from now, I think one of the great historical moments of our lifetimes will happen. Pete Seeger is going to turn 90 years old. The fact that he's lived that long is one thing. The fact that he has all of his faculties intact is fantastic. The fact that he can still sing, and especially down in his lower voice, and that he's got like so many people who want to be part of his birthday celebration in Madison Square Garden is another thing. The other thing that many of us don't know is that across the country, there are going to be celebrations that same evening. And here in Seattle, at the Admiral Theater, if you go online, and look at Admiral Theater and Seeger 90 or Seeger 90 Madison Square Garden, if you want to find out about that one. Starting at 4 o'clock, there's going to be a film, The Power of Song. It's a great film about Pete Seeger. How many people have seen it? And so tell your friends about that. And then at 7 o'clock, there'll be a concert. So that's really worth... I think that when we talk about culture, you know, there's 2 things in there, and this relates to the second thing I wanted to say. Culture isn't about our community, because we don't have just one community. Each one of our people, each one of us has many different communities that we relate to, like pebbles falling or water trickling onto a stream or something like that, or a pond. The reverberations go out, they come back in. We're a part. Communities is what we need to be talking about. If somebody starts talking about community, think communities. The other thing is about what class we're a part of. We all come from different classes. We have experienced different classes. Basically, everybody in this room, I'm willing to bet, is a part of one class, basically, and that is the working class. And we are working class because we're it, folks. You know, we aren't living off of a whole bunch of money that came to us for free. We go out and we do our work, we do our volunteer work, etc., and we are a part of the people who do the work, and the only class that really is going to make a difference in the world is the workers of the world. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is that I went to a talk recently by Bill Porter, who's a translator. Yeah. Sure.
Let's see if we can get.
I have two quotes. I'll just give these quotes.
Can we just do it, please? Because everybody we have to get people to, make.
Well, then I'll just end with Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton said, I am so proletarian intoxicated, I cannot be astronomically intimidated.
Okay. Well, so we've got Roger and then Paul, and then we're pretty much going to be closing down. So, Roger.
Thanks. I raised my hand when Alex was speaking, and this may be disjointed, but I want to go back to what he said. I raised my hand when Alex was speaking, and I want to go back to what he was saying. Yeah. I'm happy to hear someone speak on the urgency of the environmental situation. I work in energy conservation and environmental politics myself. But I wasn't too comfortable with the way that you framed the issue. It reminded me very much of something that Mark has severely criticized in our own past, how the anti-war movement became, rightfully I think, so overwhelmingly concerned and outraged by the situation that we had in the 60s, the Vietnam War, and the 70s, that it was all-consuming, and again, probably rightly. But it became our whole lives and the whole issue, and so urgent that, I used to go around saying, the fundamental thing about our politics is we're in a hurry. We got to stop this as soon as possible.
But it ended.
It did. Well, it ended, and we played a part in that. But we also did a lot of self-destructive and other destructive things, including destroying our own organization. So I think that came from just a lack of perspective about what you can do and how you can do it and how you can do it most effectively. Wanting to do the ultimate and the maximum, though admirable, is not necessarily a strategy. We have to do what can be done. And we're not going to reduce energy use by 90 to 95% in 20 years. It's just not going to happen. I mean, I wish it could, but realistically, that's not what's happening. If we set a longer time frame, then it's something that we can actually think about. That, of course, we have to start now and do everything that we can. For instance, one thing that we could do is make all cars meet the standard of the Prius as soon as possible. Then, after 3 years of all cars being sold at that standard, replacing existing cars, we could stop importing all oil from the Middle East. That would be a big thing politically and economically and environmentally. And that's just the beginning, but I'm going to stop there.
You better. I was going to ask him, I have a Prius, Roger. And also, I do live on funds from not my own earning, I think, at least, because I hardly ever worked in my life. But I get Social Security. There you go. I wish it were more.
You earned that.
Thank you. I guess I just slightly. If you want to learn about the future, the earlier Seattle and these kind of things and what people did, then read Rich Berner's books. They go from 1900 to 1950, the history of Seattle. Rich Berner, 3 volumes. And it's full of all these kind of things discussed. The other thing I wanted to bring up hasn't been brought up yet, and that is another big problem. That is the human capacity for self-deception, religious wars, I'm thinking, and the human capacity for great technical ingenuity. And you put together the capacity to annihilate ourselves and the capacity to wish to be annihilated so that we can join the Lord in some sort of great bounty hereafter. That's a very big problem for us to deal with.
Paul, you're at the end.
Well,
just a couple disparate thoughts. I mean, one is it seems really important to look and see where there is motion in the society now, and there's motion in a bunch of places. I mean, there are some really, Robbie touched on some really huge, ambitious ideas being put out by the Obama administration with absolutely zero guarantee that they're going to pass, and it's totally going to be up to whether or not people can actually do those very classic things with some new ways of organizing and mobilizing to be able to convince enough votes to go through to get some decent stuff passed. I mean, it's a very historic opportunity created by the multiple intersecting crises of our time, where a bunch of things are suddenly up for grabs that weren't up for grabs about 5 years ago, or at least people didn't see them as such. I think Roger is raising a pretty important point about I'm in the middle of revising this book of mine, Soul of a Citizen, after 10 years, and I came to this section called Radical Patience. And I'd barely mentioned global warming and know a hell of a lot more about it, as most of us do, and how much the clock is ticking. And I'm thinking, what does radical patience mean in a time of global warming when we have these literally finite deadlines to either continue to make the world habitable or not? And I think what it means is simultaneously recognizing and articulating the urgency and cultivating the patience that says you don't know the timelines when something's going to leap, and therefore, what you can't do is say, shit, we lost this particular battle, giving up going home, or get increasingly frantic. So I remember Helen Caldicott, who many of us remember as probably the single most influential person in the nuclear peace movement, brought more people in, arguably, than any other person on the planet, and then proceeded to burn them out because all she could portray was a picture of annihilation, and I saw people melting away because somehow she couldn't get out of that moment where all she saw was a very real reality that there was 6 minutes away from each other of the US and Soviets, and we were on the verge of blowing ourselves all up. So somehow we've got to be able to do a couple of things. One is be very honest about the real constraints of our time, the real urgencies of it, but we also have to actually look at people where they're moving. I mean, I was giving a talk in Atlantic City, and there's the municipal sewage of sort of the 4 counties. You now have wind turbines because of this small municipal sewage plant. All the tourists who go in see the wind turbines. There are a lot of people who don't necessarily see themselves as part of radical political movements or anything else, who are in motion, who are potential allies on these issues, and we not need to be looking for those things.
Excellent. Okay, so
I think what we can say is that the conversation continues and will continue. It'll probably continue over Chinese food for those who want to come afterwards, because we all have to eat. But at this point, it's through in this room, folks.